A millionaire hired a humble cleaner to clean his mansion. One day, he came home early and was stunned to see what she had done with his 7-year-old son. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers running gently over the creased bills in her hand. It wasn't much, just enough to cover Owen's school fees for the month and a few other essentials. She took a deep breath, glancing toward the closed door of her bedroom where her 7-year-old son, Owen, was probably fast asleep. Despite the long hours she worked, barely managing to scrape by, Grace felt a deep sense of pride and satisfaction, knowing she was providing for her son. Every day, she left home before the sun rose, boarding a bus that took her to a part of town she never thought she'd see. Calvin Ellis's mansion was nestled in the heart of Brookhaven, a neighborhood that looked like it had been plucked out of a fairy tale with its sprawling lawns, grand fountains, and endless rows of perfectly trimmed hedges. She had worked as a cleaner in this opulent home for nearly 2 years, but each day still felt surreal. She was surrounded by luxury, gold-trimmed chandeliers, marble floors, and furniture worth more than she could ever imagine. Yet, none of it felt like hers. It was simply the place where she worked. As Grace walked through the mansion's endless corridors, her focus remained on her tasks. She wasn't there to gawk at the artwork or daydream about the view from the expansive windows. Her priority was ensuring she did her job well and efficiently, with no complaints. That way, she could keep her position and continue paying for Owen's education and future. The thought of him was enough to keep her grounded, to remind her why she was working so hard. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Owen was attending a modest school, where he was one of the few children from a single-parent household. Grace made it a point to never let him feel different, to give him the best she could, even if it meant cutting corners on her own needs. She wanted him to feel secure, to feel as though he belonged. At just 7, Owen was already growing into a sensitive and thoughtful boy, always curious, always eager to understand the world around him. He often asked her questions about her work, curious about the big house she worked in. But Grace always kept her responses brief. It wasn't something she felt he needed to worry about, especially not at his age. Working in the Ellis mansion meant she saw Calvin Ellis from time to time, though their interactions were minimal. He was a tall, composed man with an air of authority that filled every room he entered. He was known in business circles as a brilliant, ruthless leader, but to Grace, he was simply her employer, aloof, distant, and focused on his own world. On the rare occasions when they passed each other in the hall, Calvin would give her a nod, barely acknowledging her presence. She didn't mind. She wasn't there to be seen. Grace's world revolved around her son, while Calvin's seemed to be solely about his work. His son, Eli, was often left alone or with caretakers, and Grace would occasionally see the young boy wandering through the halls with a forlorn expression. She didn't know much about him, but had heard from other staff that Eli's mother had passed away a few years ago, and since then, Calvin had thrown himself into his work, leaving Eli under the care of nannies and tutors. It was no wonder the boy seemed so isolated. Grace had caught glimpses of him playing alone or sitting quietly by himself, always with a faint sadness in his eyes. One afternoon, as she dusted the shelves in the family room, Grace thought of how different her life was from those who lived in this grand house. Here she was, constantly worried about how she'd make it through the month, while the Ellis family never seemed to worry about a thing. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that, in some strange way, she and Eli shared a certain loneliness, a sense of being out of place, disconnected from the world around them. But Grace was resilient. Her life may not have been filled with luxuries, but it was full of purpose. Every decision she made, every sacrifice was for Owen. And while she might never be wealthy, she was rich in love for her son. Her days in the mansion were simply a means to an end, a way to secure a better future for him. As she finished her tasks for the day, Grace glanced out one of the tall windows overlooking the sprawling garden. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the perfectly manicured hedges, the flowers blooming in a riot of colors. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what life might have been like if things had turned out differently. But just as quickly, she brushed the thought away. This was her reality, a life of hard work, but also a life filled with love. Gathering her things, she prepared to head home. Her heart lightened as she thought of Owen's face lighting up as he opened the door, running into her arms. For Grace, that was worth more than any mansion or fortune. The next morning, as Calvin Ellis prepared for another day of endless meetings, business deals, and negotiations, he glanced at his reflection in the mirror, his neatly pressed suit, the expensive watch around his wrist, and his calm, steely gaze all signaled success. He was a man who had built a business empire from the ground up, commanding respect and fear in the corporate world. But beneath that composed exterior, there was an emptiness he couldn't seem to shake, a hollowness he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Calvin's mind drifted briefly to his son, Eli. He couldn't remember the last time they'd shared a genuine conversation. Even the occasional greetings in the morning or at night had started to feel like an obligation rather than a real connection. It wasn't that he didn't care about his son. He did, in his own way, but he didn't know how to reach him. Since his wife's passing, Calvin had poured all his energy into his work, convincing himself that if he built a stable future, Eli would be taken care of. Money, he thought, would solve everything. It was why he worked tirelessly, often late into the night, barely noticing how much time had passed until he returned to a quiet, dark mansion. As he headed down the staircase that morning, he caught sight of Eli sitting alone at the breakfast table, his head bent as he absent-mindedly pushed his cereal around with a spoon. Calvin paused at the bottom of the stairs, watching him for a moment. There was something almost haunting in the way his son sat there, so small and solitary, surrounded by all the luxuries money could buy, but clearly lacking something far more essential. "Good morning, Eli," he said, stepping into the room with his usual reserved tone. Eli looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected his father to acknowledge him. "Good morning," he replied softly, his voice barely audible. Calvin cleared his throat, feeling the awkwardness settling between them. "Are you ready for school?" he asked, hoping to fill the silence with something, anything. Eli nodded, but there was no spark in his eyes, no excitement. The boy seemed almost ghost-like, as if he were merely going through the motions of his day. Calvin couldn't quite understand why it bothered him so much, but there was a pang of guilt as he watched his son's sullen expression. He wanted to say something else, to bridge the gap between them, but the words wouldn't come. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the brief connection. He took it out. Glancing at the screen, a call from his assistant, already reminding him of the day's agenda. His mind snapped back to work, and the moment slipped away. "I have to go, Eli. Have a good day at school," he said briskly, patting his son on the shoulder with a quick, absent-minded gesture before leaving the room. As he walked out, he didn't notice Eli's gaze drop back to his cereal, the hint of disappointment settling into the boy's expression. Once again, in the late afternoon, Grace arrived at the mansion for her shift. She went through her tasks methodically, cleaning each room, dusting the shelves, and polishing the surfaces until they gleamed. She had grown used to the silence that pervaded the house, a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Despite its grandeur, there was a sense of isolation that hung heavy in the air, particularly around young Eli. As she moved toward the family room, Grace noticed Eli sitting alone on the sofa. Clutching a small stuffed animal in his hands, he looked up when she entered, his eyes curious yet cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether he should acknowledge her presence or retreat back into his own world. Grace offered him a gentle smile, sensing the sadness in his gaze. "Hey there, Eli," she said softly, her voice warm and inviting. Eli shifted, glancing down at the stuffed animal in his hands. "Hi," he replied, almost in a whisper. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked, sensing his loneliness. He shook his head slowly. "Not really." Grace felt a pang of empathy for him. She couldn't imagine what it must be like to feel so alone in such a big house. With only the occasional presence of nannies and staff, she wanted to say something comforting, something to make him feel less isolated, but she knew her place. She was just the cleaner, after all. Still, she couldn't help herself. "You know, I used to feel a little lonely when I was your age, too," she said, hoping he would feel understood. Eli looked up, his interest piqued. "You did?" Grace nodded. "I did. Sometimes I'd feel like no one really noticed me, but I'd always remind myself that I was special, even if no one else knew it. And you know what? That made me feel better, for the first time." She saw a faint smile tug at the corners of Eli's lips. He nodded, clutching his stuffed animal a little tighter. "Thanks, Grace," he murmured, almost as if he were afraid to speak any louder. At that moment, Calvin walked into the room, his gaze landing on Eli and Grace. His expression was unreadable. But Grace immediately straightened, feeling a sudden tension. She could sense his disapproval, the way he observed her interaction with his son, as if questioning her motives. Calvin's face remained impassive, though he took note of Eli's slight smile, the first he'd seen in a long time for a brief moment. He wondered what Grace had said to his son to make him look happier, but he brushed off the thought, convincing himself it was unimportant. With a brisk nod to Grace, he turned and walked out, leaving them once again in silence. Grace couldn't shake the feeling of Calvin's gaze from her mind. His expression had been unreadable, but there was a tension in the way he'd looked at her and Eli, almost as if he were wary of their interaction. She reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. She'd only offered a few kind words to a lonely boy. Still, she knew that working for people like Calvin meant keeping a certain distance, and she was careful not to blur those lines. Days passed, each one blending into the next as she went about her routine, cleaning rooms and tidying spaces that always looked pristine to begin with. She saw Eli here and there, often alone, his expression thoughtful and quiet. Occasionally, he would glance her way and offer a shy smile, and Grace would return it warmly. It felt as though a small bond was forming between them, something she hadn't expected but welcomed nonetheless. One afternoon, while polishing the silver in the dining room, Grace heard the sound of laughter coming from the hallway. She paused, almost disbelieving. The sound was bright, joyful, and so out of place in the usually silent mansion that it startled her. She set down the silverware and walked toward the sound. Her curiosity piqued. She found Eli in one of the spare bedrooms, his little face alight with laughter as he bounced around the room, holding one of the fancy decorative pillows like it was a prized possession. Grace stood in the doorway, watching him with a gentle smile. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him this animated, and something about his happiness filled her with a warmth she hadn't expected. "Grace," Eli called out when he noticed her, his eyes shining with excitement. "Look, I'm pretending this is a treasure, and I'm a pirate looking for it," she chuckled, stepping into the room. "A treasure, huh? Well, Captain Eli, it looks like you found the finest treasure in all the land." He grinned, clutching the pillow to his chest. "You can be my first mate," he said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "We have to guard the treasure from the enemy." Grace played along, pretending to look around for any potential intruders. She crouched beside him, making a serious face. "All right, Captain. I'll keep an eye out. No one will take our treasure as long as I'm around." They spent a few minutes like that, wrapped up in their imaginary world, laughing and whispering conspiratorially about invisible foes. For a little while, it felt like the mansion's heavy silence was lifted, replaced by their shared joy. Eli's laughter was infectious, filling the room with a kind of life Grace had never felt there before. But their game was interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps approaching. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she realized it was Calvin. She straightened up quickly, smoothing out her uniform and giving Eli a small, apologetic smile. Calvin appeared in the doorway, his expression stern, his gaze moving from Eli to Grace. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged with tension. Eli's smile faded and he looked down. Clutching the pillow tighter, Grace cleared her throat, feeling a bit like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. "We were just playing a little game, Mr. Ellis. I apologize if we disturbed you." Calvin's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said slowly, his tone heavy with unspoken judgment. He looked down at Eli, who was fidgeting, his earlier joy now replaced by nervousness. "Eli," Calvin said, his voice softening just a bit. "It's time to get ready for dinner. Go on now." Eli nodded, casting Grace one last shy smile before hurrying out of the room, leaving her alone with Calvin. She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, unsure of what to say. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but something about the way he was looking at her made her feel as if she had overstepped. "I hope you understand that I expect a certain level of professionalism here." "Grace," Calvin said finally, his tone cool. "I don't want you getting too involved." Grace held her ground, meeting his gaze with quiet composure. "I understand, Mr. Ellis. But Eli, he's a good kid. Sometimes a little kindness goes a long way. For a moment, Calvin seemed taken aback by her response. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then stopped, his expression shifting to something more guarded. After a brief, tense pause, he gave her a curt nod. "Very well," he said, his voice measured. "But I'd appreciate it if you could focus on your tasks. There's no need for distractions." Grace bit back a response. Simply nodding, she watched as Calvin turned and left, his shoulders stiff, his presence leaving the room colder than it had been just moments ago. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She had only wanted to offer a small bit of joy to Eli, who clearly needed it. The look on his face as they'd played together, that was the look of a child finally feeling seen, feeling cared for. It was a simple gesture, but it had meant so much to him. She couldn't understand why Calvin seemed so opposed to it. On the bus ride home, Grace replayed the scene in her mind, wondering if she had indeed crossed a line. She looked out the window, the lights of the city blurring as she thought of Owen waiting for her, his face lighting up when she walked through the door. She couldn't help but think of Eli, who might have had that same expression if his father could only see him, truly see him, for who he was. With a sigh, she closed her eyes, hoping that, somehow, her presence in Eli's life could offer him even a small comfort. Little did she know, her impact on the Ellis mansion, and on Calvin's heart, was only just beginning. Calvin couldn't quite shake the image of Grace and Eli laughing together from his mind. He told himself it was insignificant, a brief moment of childish play that shouldn't concern him. Yet, the sight had stirred something within him, a vague unease mixed with curiosity. He found himself thinking about it throughout the day, the sound of Eli's laughter echoing in his mind far longer than he'd expected. As the days passed, Calvin began to observe Grace more closely, though he did so discreetly. Whenever he returned to the mansion earlier than usual, he'd catch fleeting glimpses of her working quietly, her presence unassuming yet oddly reassuring. There was a warmth about her, a kind of gentle, calm energy that seemed to affect everyone around her, even his son. One evening, as he reviewed some financial reports in his study, Calvin's thoughts drifted back to Grace. He couldn't deny the positive effect she seemed to have on Eli. His son was smiling more, seemed more engaged, and even his teachers had mentioned improvements in his behavior, yet a seed of doubt lingered. Calvin had encountered too many people who feigned kindness and warmth for personal gain. In his world, where wealth attracted opportunists, he'd learned to be skeptical of others' intentions. The thought unsettled him. What if Grace was merely pretending, trying to worm her way into Eli's affections for some ulterior motive? The idea gnawed at him, twisting his view of her. He convinced himself that it was prudent, even necessary, to be cautious. The next morning, Calvin decided to observe her more openly. He came down for breakfast at an unusual time. Knowing Grace would be working nearby, he took his seat at the table, pretending to be absorbed in his tablet. Though his attention was squarely on her, Grace moved through the dining room, quietly polishing the table's surface and straightening the chairs. She seemed completely focused, working with a kind of grace and humility that felt oddly out of place in such a grand setting. Calvin couldn't see anything overtly suspicious in her behavior, yet his unease persisted. At that moment, Eli entered the room, his face lighting up as he spotted Grace. "Good morning, Grace," he chirped, walking over to stand beside her. Grace paused her work and smiled down at him. "Good morning." "Good." "Eli, how did you sleep?" Eli shrugged. "Okay, I guess, but I had a dream we were pirates again," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Grace chuckled, crouching down to his level. "Really? Did we find any new treasure?" Eli nodded eagerly. "Yeah, but this time it was a whole room full of gold coins and jewels. You were there, and you helped me fight off the bad guys." Their exchange was simple, but there was a familiarity and warmth in it that tugged at Calvin. He clenched his jaw, feeling a strange mixture of jealousy and discomfort. It struck him how easily Eli seemed to open up to Grace, how naturally his son connected with her in ways he couldn't. Deciding to put an end to their conversation, Calvin cleared his throat. "Eli, you should eat your breakfast. You don't want to be late for school." Eli looked at him, a hint of disappointment crossing his face, but he obediently moved to the table, taking his seat. Grace, sensing Calvin's discomfort, resumed her work without a word. her demeanor composed and professional. Later that evening, after Eli had gone to bed, Calvin found himself pacing his study, the memory of the morning's exchange nagging at him. He wanted to believe that Grace's intentions were pure, that her kindness toward Eli was genuine, but his doubts persisted, fueled by years of navigating a world where everyone seemed to want something from him. Unable to shake his suspicions, he made a decision. The next day, he would confront her. He needed to know where she stood, to understand her motives. He could no longer ignore the influence she was having on Eli. And, if he was honest with himself, on him as well. The following afternoon, Calvin found Grace in the family room, arranging a vase of fresh flowers on the table. He cleared his throat, catching her attention. She looked up, surprised but composed, her expression neutral. "Mr. Ellis," she greeted politely, stepping back to give him space. "Grace," he began, his voice measured, "I wanted to speak with you about something important." He paused, his gaze fixed on her, searching for any hint of deception. "I've noticed that you've been spending a lot of time with Eli." Grace's expression softened. "He's a wonderful boy. Mr. Ellis, he just seems lonely sometimes. I think he enjoys having someone to talk to." Calvin's jaw tightened. "Yes, I can see that, but I have to ask, what exactly are your intentions?" Grace blinked, taken aback. "My intentions?" "Yes," he said, his tone hardening. "It's not uncommon for people to develop attachments, especially when they're around wealth. I need to know if you're simply doing your job, or if there's something more." A flash of hurt crossed Grace's face, but she quickly composed herself. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Mr. Ellis, I understand your concerns, but I assure you, my only intention is to do my job and make sure Eli feels cared for. I'm not interested in your wealth or anything else. Eli deserves kindness, and I'm only trying to provide that." Calvin felt a twinge of guilt at her response, but his skepticism held firm. "I hope that's true," he said, his tone softened but still guarded. "Because if I find that you're trying to use him, or me, you'll be dismissed immediately." Grace nodded, her face impassive, though he sensed the hurt in her eyes. "Understood, Mr. Ellis," she replied, her voice steady. "If you'd prefer, I can limit my interactions with Eli to strictly professional terms." For a moment, Calvin felt the weight of his own words, sensing that he had crossed a line, but he held his ground, nodding curtly. That would be best. As Grace resumed her work, Calvin turned and left the room, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. He had expected to feel a sense of relief, but instead, he felt unsettled. Something told him that he had made a mistake, that perhaps, in his desperation to protect his world, he was losing something far more important. And as he lay in bed that night, sleep eluding him, he couldn't shake the image of Grace's hurt expression, or the quiet strength in her words as she had defended herself. The following day, Grace moved through her tasks with a heaviness in her heart. Calvin's accusations from the day before echoed in her mind, stinging far more than she wanted to admit. She had worked hard to stay focused and professional, and though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, Calvin's words had cut deep. The implication that she could be manipulating his son for personal gain struck at her integrity, at the very core of who she was. For Grace, her work was not just about making a living. It was about maintaining her dignity, even in the face of judgment from people who barely knew her. Grace continued her duties as usual, keeping a safe distance from Eli whenever she saw him. She hated the thought of pulling back from the boy who had so clearly come to trust her, but she had no choice. Calvin had made it clear that he didn't want her getting close to Eli, and she wasn't about to risk her job, especially not with Owen depending on her. She had managed to build a stable life for them, and she couldn't let anything threaten that stability, even if it meant sacrificing the small connection she had formed with Eli. The shift in Grace's demeanor didn't go unnoticed. Eli, who was accustomed to her warm smiles and gentle presence, sensed her pulling away. Each time he tried to approach her, she offered a polite smile but didn't linger. She kept her distance, always moving on to her next task, avoiding any prolonged interaction. It confused him, and he began to feel a sense of sadness creeping back, a loneliness that he thought he'd left behind when Grace had started spending time with him. A few days later, as she was dusting the shelves in the family room, Eli approached her, clutching the same stuffed animal he often carried around. He looked up at her with those big, hopeful eyes, and Grace's heart ached at the sight. "Grace," he said softly, tugging on her sleeve. Did I do something wrong?" The question took her by surprise, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She crouched down, forcing a smile as she looked into his innocent face. "Of course not, Eli. You didn't do anything wrong. But you don't play with me anymore," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did my dad say you can't?" Grace hesitated, not wanting to say too much but not wanting to lie to him either. She took a steadying breath and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes grown-ups have to follow certain rules, even if they don't want to. It doesn't mean I don't care about you, okay?" Eli nodded slowly, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "Okay," he said, his voice trailing off as he hugged his stuffed animal a little tighter as Grace straightened and continued with her work. She couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that lingered in her chest. She didn't want Eli to feel abandoned, especially when he'd already been through so much. But her hands were tied. She was simply a cleaner in this house, not a member of the family, and she had to remember her place that evening. As she was getting ready to leave, Calvin entered the room, his expression unreadable. She braced herself, wondering if he had more criticisms to offer, more accusations to throw her way. "Grace," he said, his tone formal, "I've noticed a change in Eli's behavior recently. He seems more withdrawn, less happy." Grace's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her expression calm. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Ellis. I've been keeping my distance just as you asked." He frowned, seeming slightly taken aback. "That's not what I meant. I didn't want him to get too attached, but I didn't expect you to pull away entirely." Grace met his gaze, a hint of frustration flashing in her eyes. "With all due respect, Mr. Ellis, I was simply following your instructions. You made it clear that you didn't want me to have any unnecessary involvement with Eli." Calvin looked at her, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them. She could see the flicker of conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his need to protect his world and the growing awareness of how much Eli needed a caring presence in his life. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Maybe I overreacted. It's hard for me to trust people." Grace took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Mr. Ellis, I understand that, truly, but I'm here to work, to earn an honest living for my son. I would never do anything to betray that trust, Eli. He's just a boy who needs someone to be there for him." There was a vulnerability in her words that seemed to reach Calvin, and for a brief moment he softened. But just as quickly, he pulled back, his expression hardening once more. "Perhaps," he said, his voice clipped, "but I still think it would be best if you continued to keep a professional distance." Grace felt a pang of disappointment, but nodded, accepting his decision. She turned to leave, but something inside her snapped. She couldn't go on like this, constantly walking on eggshells, feeling as though every small kindness was scrutinized and misjudged. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice firm, "I think it's time for me to move on. I'll finish my tasks for the day, but after that, I'll be leaving." Calvin looked at her, stunned. "You're resigning?" She nodded, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I can't work in a place where every action I take is questioned, where kindness is viewed as manipulation. I have a son to take care of, and he deserves a mother who's treated with respect and dignity." Calvin's expression faltered, and for a moment, she thought she saw regret in his eyes. But he said nothing, only nodding curtly. "Very well, if that's what you feel is best." Grace turned and left the room, her heart pounding. She knew it was a risk, but she couldn't let herself stay in a place where her intentions were constantly doubted. She had to put Owen first, to ensure he saw her as someone who valued integrity above all else. That night, as she packed up her things, she felt a bittersweet relief. She would miss Eli, but she knew she had made the right choice. Her future, and Owen's, depended on it. The silence that filled the mansion after Grace's departure was unsettling. Calvin returned home the following evening to find the house feeling emptier than ever, a hollow stillness that even he noticed. He hadn't expected her resignation to have any impact on him personally. She was just a cleaner, after all, a small part of his carefully structured life. And yet, Her absence left a palpable void, one that grew more noticeable with each passing day. But it was Eli who felt the absence most keenly. The first night without Grace, he waited anxiously for her to appear, clutching his favorite stuffed animal, his eyes darting toward the doorway every few minutes as the hours ticked by and she never came. His hope dimmed. His father's stoic presence offered little comfort, and even when Calvin asked him about his day, Eli responded in monosyllables, his gaze distant. The following days didn't get any easier. Every time he saw a member of the staff, Eli would perk up, hoping to see Grace's familiar face. Only to be disappointed, he tried asking his father about her once, his voice quiet and hesitant. "Where did Grace go?" he asked one morning at breakfast, his eyes downcast as he poked at his cereal. Calvin stiffened, setting down his coffee cup. He hadn't expected Eli to bring it up so directly. "Grace had to move on to another job," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "She had her own responsibilities to take care of." Eli's face fell, and Calvin felt a pang of guilt. He wanted to say something more comforting, but the words didn't come. He didn't know how to explain to his son that he'd been the reason for Grace's departure, or that he had driven away the one person who had seemed to make Eli truly happy. He could only watch as his son retreated further into himself, becoming quieter, more withdrawn. Days turned into a week, and Eli's mood worsened. Calvin tried to distract him with new toys, even scheduling outings to places Eli usually loved. But nothing seemed to work. The boy's laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation that Calvin couldn't ignore. Even his teachers had called, concerned about Eli's sudden lack of engagement. It seemed like his son was slipping further and further out of reach, and Calvin felt powerless to stop it. One evening, Calvin found himself sitting in his study, staring blankly at his laptop. His mind was miles away from the spreadsheets and reports in front of him. Instead, he kept thinking about that last conversation with Grace, about the hurt in her eyes as she defended her actions. He'd accused her of using his son for personal gain, of having ulterior motives, and she had resigned because of it. Looking back, he realized just how unfair he'd been. Grace had brought a warmth into Eli's life that no one else had managed, not even himself. A knock on his study door pulled him from his thoughts. One of the household staff entered, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Mr. Ellis, I thought you should know, Eli hasn't been eating much these past few days," she said, wringing her hands. "He barely touched his dinner tonight, and he keeps asking about Grace." Calvin clenched his jaw, feeling a mixture of frustration and helplessness. He was used to fixing problems with quick solutions, with the right words or the right amount of money, but none of that seemed to work here. He had driven away the one person who had brought Eli a sense of joy and comfort, and now he was paying the price. "Thank you," he said quietly, dismissing her. Once she left, he sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples as the weight of his choices bore down on him. The truth was, he had been afraid that someone like Grace, someone who didn't belong to his world, might come in and disrupt the structure he had carefully built around himself and his son. He hadn't wanted her influence, hadn't wanted to feel vulnerable, but now he could see the cost of his decisions reflected in his son's sadness. He had tried to shield Eli, to protect him from attachments that could lead to disappointment. Instead, he had created a wall between himself and the one person who mattered most. That night, after tucking Eli into bed, Calvin lingered by his son's door, watching the small figure curled up beneath the blankets. Eli looked even smaller than usual, his face drawn and pale, his hand clutching the stuffed animal Grace had once given him during one of their games. A profound sadness washed over Calvin as he realized that he had taken away the one bright spot in Eli's life. The following morning, the school called to inform Calvin that Eli had spent the entire day in silence, refusing to participate in any of the activities. He'd barely spoken to his classmates, and his teacher mentioned that he seemed increasingly withdrawn. The news shook Calvin, pushing him to confront the reality of the situation. He couldn't keep ignoring Eli's unhappiness, couldn't keep pretending that his decisions hadn't affected his son in the worst way possible. That night, Calvin sat alone in the living room, wrestling with his pride. He hated to admit that he'd been wrong, that his suspicions and insecurities had caused so much harm. But for Eli's sake, he knew he had to swallow his pride. He needed Grace, and more importantly, Eli needed her. She had brought something to his son's life that he himself couldn't provide. A sense of belonging, of being seen and loved. With a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed Grace's number, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed each digit. He had her contact information from the employee records, though he had never thought he would need to use it. The phone rang, each ring heightening his anticipation, until finally, he heard her voice on the other end. "Hello, Grace, it's Calvin Ellis," he said, the words catching slightly in his throat. He hesitated, not quite sure how to start, but knowing he had to find a way to make things right. I need to talk to you about Eli." There was a pause on the line, and he could almost feel her hesitation, but she didn't hang up. Instead, she replied softly, "What is it, Mr. Ellis?" He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Grace, I owe you an apology. Eli hasn't been the same since you left. He misses you, and, if I'm being honest, I realize now how wrong I was. I let my own fears get in the way, and I've made a mistake." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, he feared she wouldn't respond. But then he heard her sigh, a mix of surprise and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Ellis, I appreciate the apology," she said gently. "But if you're calling for Eli's sake, you need to understand that my presence alone isn't a quick fix. He needs more than just a temporary connection." Calvin nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I understand that now, but I'm asking, Grace, if you would consider coming back, not just for Eli, but because I know that he deserves to have someone like you in his life." Grace's heart ached as she listened to Calvin on the phone. She'd never expected him to call, let alone apologize. His voice, usually so controlled and detached, held an unfamiliar vulnerability. For a moment, she felt the weight of his regret and the sincerity in his words, but she couldn't ignore the emotional toll his mistrust had taken on her. Still, she couldn't help but think of Eli, his shy smile, and the light in his eyes whenever they shared a moment. The thought of him, hurting and confused by her absence, made her heart twist. "I'll think about it," she replied softly, her voice carefully measured. "But Mr. Ellis, if I come back, things need to be different. Eli needs stability, and I can't keep putting myself in a position where every act of kindness is questioned." Calvin took a moment before responding. "I understand, Grace. Truly, I don't want to make the same mistakes again. I realize now that Eli's well-being should come before my pride. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." They ended the call with a sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. Grace knew returning wouldn't be easy, but the thought of Eli alone in that big, cold house filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She resolved to make a decision soon, hoping to provide the comfort Eli needed. The following day, Grace spent her time thinking deeply about what her return might mean. She spoke with Owen, explaining that she might be going back to work at the Ellis mansion, and he nodded in understanding. Owen had always been mature for his age, and he seemed to sense that Grace's work with Eli was more than just a job. But while Grace was weighing her decision, Eli's world was growing darker. Confused and heartbroken, he couldn't understand why Grace had left so abruptly. To him, it felt as if she had abandoned him, and he couldn't shake the sense of loss that consumed him. Each day, he clung to the hope that she might return. But with each passing hour, his optimism faded. One afternoon, in a fit of desperation, Eli decided to take matters into his own hands. His father had left for the office early that day, as usual, and the staff were busy with their daily routines. Eli slipped out of his room unnoticed, heading toward the front door. He didn't know exactly where Grace lived, but he remembered overhearing a conversation about a bus she took from the mansion to get home. He walked out of the mansion's gates, his small feet moving with determination as he made his way down the sidewalk. The streets were unfamiliar, filled with the sounds of traffic and bustling pedestrians. People passed him by, barely sparing him a glance as he wandered, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. Meanwhile, at the mansion, one of the housekeepers noticed Eli's absence. She checked his room, then alerted the other staff, who began searching the grounds, growing more frantic with each passing minute. Finally, they called Calvin at the office, their voices filled with urgency as they informed him that Eli was missing. Calvin's heart sank. The memory of Grace's words echoed in his mind. Her warnings about Eli's need for stability, for genuine care, He realized with a sickening dread that his son had felt so abandoned, so desperate, that he'd left on his own, seeking the one person who had made him feel loved. He left his office in a rush, barely pausing to grab his keys as he raced to the car. The drive back to the mansion felt like an eternity, each minute stretching out with the weight of his guilt and fear. When he arrived, the staff filled him in on the details, explaining that Eli had been seen heading in the direction of the main road. Without a second thought, Calvin drove down the same route, scanning the sidewalks and intersections, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding as he searched for any sign of his son. He could only hope that Eli was safe, that he hadn't gone far. Then, just as he reached a busy intersection, he saw a small figure near the edge of the road. It was Eli, standing uncertainly by the curb, his eyes wide with fear as cars zoomed past him. Calvin felt his breath catch in his throat, panic surging through him as he pulled over quickly, leaving the car running as he ran toward his son. "Eli!" he shouted, his voice laced with urgency. Eli turned, relief flooding his face as he saw his father. But in his distraction, he took an unsteady step backward, his foot slipping off the curb just as a car sped around the corner. Calvin's heart lurched as he watched the scene unfold in slow motion. He surged forward, his arms outstretched, and managed to pull Eli back, just as the car screeched to a halt, missing him by mere inches. Eli clung to Calvin, his small frame shaking with fear and shock. Calvin held him tightly, his own heart racing as the reality of what had nearly happened sank in. He hadn't realized just how fragile his son was, just how deeply Eli's loneliness had affected him. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his responsibility, the gravity of the emotional neglect he had subjected his son to. "Eli," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Eli looked up at him, his eyes brimming with tears. I wanted to find Grace. I thought, maybe if I found her, things would be okay again." Calvin's chest tightened at his son's words. The desperation in Eli's voice was a painful reminder of everything he'd failed to provide. He hugged his son tightly, brushing a tear from Eli's cheek as he murmured, "I know, Eli, I know. I'll make it right. I promise." They sat by the curb for a few moments, letting the tension of the near accident melt away. Calvin felt a renewed determination. He would make things right, not just for Eli, but for himself, for Grace, and for the family he hadn't realized he wanted until now. Later that night, back at the mansion, Calvin called Grace again. His voice was quiet, but there was a depth to it that hadn't been there before. "Grace," he began, his voice raw with emotion, "I need you to come back. Eli, he needs you. I need you. I've been wrong, and I can't change the past, but I want to give Eli the happiness he deserves, and that means doing this together, with you." Grace was silent for a moment before responding, her tone soft but resolute. "I'll be there tomorrow," for the first time in a long time. Calvin felt a flicker of hope. He knew there was still much to mend, but with Grace's return, he felt ready to build a life for Eli, a life filled with the love and care that he had so desperately needed. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Ellis mansion with mixed emotions. She felt a tug of relief, knowing she'd see Eli again, but a lingering doubt gnawed at her. The wounds Calvin's accusations had left were still fresh, and part of her worried that this return might only bring more complications. But when she thought of Eli's desperate need for stability and comfort, she knew she had to be there for him. As she stepped through the grand entrance, she was met with the familiar gleam of the marble floors and the distant echo of her footsteps. But today, the atmosphere felt different. One of the staff members greeted her with a warm smile, nodding in acknowledgement as if silently thanking her for coming back. Grace felt a small pang of comfort, reassured that, at least to some, her return was appreciated. Moments later, Calvin entered the hallway, his posture slightly stiff, but his expression open and contrite. Grace met his gaze. Noting the exhaustion and worry etched into his face, he looked different. Somehow, less guarded, more vulnerable. She could tell he had been deeply affected by everything that had happened, and she steeled herself, ready for whatever he had to say. "Grace," he began, his voice softer than usual. as if he were struggling to find the right words. "Thank you for coming back. I know I've given you every reason not to, and I don't take your decision lightly." She nodded, maintaining her composure. "I'm here for Eli," she replied simply but firmly. He swallowed, acknowledging her words. "Yes, of course, and I know he's the one who needs you most. But I also owe you an apology." Calvin's gaze dropped briefly before returning to hers. His tone weighted with sincerity. "I've been wrong in so many ways. I judged you unfairly, and I questioned your intentions without ever giving you the benefit of the doubt. I thought I was protecting Eli, but I see now that I was only keeping him from what he truly needed." Grace listened, her face impassive, though her heart softened slightly. She had longed to hear these words, but she had also come to realize that actions would speak louder than any apology. Calvin took a step closer, his voice almost pleading. "I understand if you're hesitant. I've made it hard for you to trust me, and I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I'm asking you, Grace, to stay for Eli's sake. He needs the kind of love and care only you've been able to give him." Grace took a deep breath, her expression softening as she replied, "I'll stay, Mr. Ellis, but I need you to understand that this isn't just about Eli anymore. He's a wonderful child, but he deserves more than the life he's been given. If I'm going to be here, it has to be in an environment where he feels safe and cared for. By all of us." Calvin nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "You're right. I want to be there for him too. In a way I haven't been. I know it will take time, but I want to learn." At that moment, Eli appeared at the top of the staircase, his small face lighting up as he spotted Grace. He let out a delighted gasp and ran down the steps, his arms outstretched, his eyes brimming with relief and happiness. "Grace," he called, his voice filled with pure joy. Grace knelt, opening her arms as Eli barreled into her embrace, hugging her tightly. She felt the warmth of his small arms around her, the tension in his little body melting as he finally felt safe again. "I missed you so much," Eli whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Oh, Eli, I missed you too," she replied, brushing a gentle hand through his hair. "I'm here now. Everything is going to be all right." Calvin watched the reunion in silence, feeling a profound sense of humility as he observed his son's joy. He hadn't realized how much Grace's presence meant to Eli, how deeply her absence had affected him. Standing there, witnessing their bond, he felt an overwhelming gratitude that she had agreed to return. Later that day, as Grace settled back into her duties, the house felt lighter. Eli followed her around, his spirit visibly lifted, his questions and stories flowing freely. She indulged his chatter, listening intently as he told her about his week at school, his favorite games, and even a few dreams he'd had. With every word, Eli seemed to grow more animated, his laughter filling the rooms and replacing the silence that had lingered since she'd left. Calvin observed them from a distance, feeling a mixture of pride and something else he couldn't quite identify. It was an unfamiliar sensation, watching his son open up, laugh, and be truly happy in the presence of someone who wasn't there out of obligation or duty, but because she genuinely cared. It was a reminder of everything he had missed in his own relationship with Eli. That evening, after Eli had gone to bed, Calvin found Grace in the kitchen, tidying up the counters. He cleared his throat, signaling his presence, and she looked up, offering him a polite nod. "I just wanted to thank you again," he began, his voice earnest. "Not just for coming back, but for everything you've done for Eli." Grace inclined her head, a soft but guarded smile on her lips. "He's a special boy, Mr. Ellis. I couldn't bear to see him unhappy." Calvin nodded, his gaze dropping momentarily. "I know it's asking a lot, but I'd like to change things. Make this place feel more like a home, not just for Eli, but for everyone here. I realize now that my focus on work has cost me more than I ever intended." Grace observed him, noting the honesty in his expression. She sensed that he was genuine, that he truly wanted to make a change, not just for Eli's sake, but for his own as well. "Then let's work on that," she replied gently. "It'll take time, but I believe it's possible." For the first time, Calvin felt a spark of hope. He had always thought that providing for Eli financially was enough, that his son would be fine as long as he was taken care of materially. But he was beginning to understand that love, attention, and connection were things he couldn't buy or delegate. It was a lesson Grace had shown him, even if it had taken him far too long to recognize it. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the mansion continued to shift. Calvin made a conscious effort to spend more time with Eli, asking him about his day, sitting with him during meals, and even joining him and Grace for a few moments of play, though it felt awkward at first. Each small interaction brought him closer to his son, and with each passing day, he found himself looking forward to those moments more and more, and Grace, though cautious, felt the beginnings of a new dynamic forming, a household no longer ruled by isolation and mistrust, but one slowly transforming into a place where love and connection were beginning to take root. For the first time, she dared to hope that they could truly build something together, something lasting and real. The days that followed Grace's return were a whirlwind of quiet but profound changes. The Ellis mansion, once steeped in cold formality, now felt different, as if it were finally coming alive. Grace could sense the shift, not just in the atmosphere, but in the people around her, especially Calvin and Eli. There was a warmth blossoming within the walls, a light that had been absent for far too long. Every morning, Eli would seek Grace out as soon as he woke up, eager to share his thoughts and dreams. His shyness seemed to melt away in her presence, replaced by an openness that Grace found endearing. They would spend time together after school, reading stories, playing make-believe, and laughing together. Calvin had initially watched these interactions from a distance, but now he began to join them. One afternoon, after a particularly animated game of hide-and-seek, Calvin found himself caught up in the joy of the moment. He laughed openly with Eli and Grace, a genuine, heartfelt sound that startled him as much as it delighted them. For years, his life had been so focused on control, on discipline and order, that he'd forgotten what it was like to simply be. But here, with Eli and Grace, he felt a warmth he hadn't realized he was missing. That evening, as they gathered in the family room, Calvin noticed how naturally they fell into this new rhythm together. Eli sat beside Grace, his head resting on her shoulder as she read aloud from his favorite storybook. Calvin found himself smiling at the sight, a sense of peace settling over him. He hadn't imagined that something as simple as being present could make him feel so complete, but seeing his son content, with Grace there to share in their lives, filled a void he hadn't even known existed after Eli went to bed that night. Calvin lingered in the family room. Grace was tidying up, folding blankets and setting pillows back in place, her movements gentle and thoughtful. He watched her for a moment, hesitating before he spoke. "Grace," he began, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I wanted to thank you again, not just for coming back, but for everything you've done for Eli, and for me." She turned to him, her expression open, though she seemed a bit surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "You've thanked me already, Mr. Ellis," she replied gently, a small smile on her lips. "But you're welcome. Eli means a lot to me." Calvin nodded, stepping closer. "He's happier than I've ever seen him," he said, his gaze dropping slightly. "And it's because of you. You've shown me things I couldn't see on my own, made me realize what I was missing." Grace felt a warmth rise in her chest at his words. There was a vulnerability in Calvin now that hadn't been there before, a softness that made him seem less like the untouchable businessman she'd first met, and more human. "Eli just needed someone to see him," she said quietly, her voice laced with kindness, "and to be there for him." Calvin met her gaze, his eyes holding a depth she hadn't seen before. "I realize now that I should have been that person," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought providing for him financially was enough, but I was wrong." Grace could feel her heart beat a little faster. There was something raw and honest in his words, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "The fact that you're realizing that now, that's what matters," she replied, her tone gentle. "Eli sees it too. He's noticed how much more you're there for him, and it means the world to him." A silence settled between them, filled with an unspoken understanding. Calvin's gaze softened as he looked at her, and she felt a subtle shift in the air, a closeness that felt natural, yet uncharted. Grace realized then how much he had changed since she'd met him, how he had gradually shed the layers of coldness and distance. There was a warmth in his eyes now, a warmth that made her heart feel unexpectedly full. "Grace," he murmured, his voice breaking the silence. "I know I've said this before, But I want you to know how much I respect what you've done. Not just for Eli, but for me as well. You've changed things for us. For the better." Grace felt her cheeks warm, a gentle blush rising as she absorbed his words. She wasn't used to hearing such heartfelt praise, especially from someone like Calvin. "I'm just doing what I can," she replied softly. "But thank you. It means a lot to hear that from you." They stood there for a moment, their eyes locked, as if each were searching for something in the other. Calvin took a small step closer, his hand lifting slightly before he let it fall again. Uncertain, he looked as if he wanted to say something more, but before he could, Eli's small voice drifted down the hallway, breaking the spell. "Dad, Grace, can you tuck me in?" Grace chuckled softly, and Calvin managed a sheepish smile. "Of course, buddy," he called back, his voice warm with affection. He looked at Grace, his eyes holding a flicker of something unspoken, before they both walked down the hall to Eli's room together. After tucking Eli in, Calvin lingered in the doorway, watching Grace as she spoke gently to his son. Her voice filled with warmth. She brushed a stray lock of hair from Eli's forehead, her hand lingering there for a moment before she stood, bidding him good night. As they left the room, walking side by side back down the hall, Calvin felt a deep contentment settle over him. He had never realized how much he'd missed these moments, these small, everyday gestures that made a house feel like a home. And it was Grace who had brought this warmth, who had opened the door to a life he hadn't known he wanted. That night, after she'd gone home, Calvin sat alone in the family room, his thoughts swirling. The past few weeks had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Grace's kindness, her strength, and her unwavering care for Eli had drawn him in, slowly dismantling the walls he'd built around himself. He hadn't thought it was possible, but he found himself caring deeply for her, in ways that went beyond gratitude. He leaned back, letting out a deep breath as he stared up at the ceiling. The mansion felt different now, alive with a warmth that was unfamiliar but welcome. And though he couldn't predict what the future held, he knew one thing for certain. He wanted Grace to be a part of it. In that quiet moment, Calvin allowed himself to imagine a life where he wasn't alone, where he had Grace and Eli by his side, filling his days with laughter, love, and the sense of belonging he had craved for so long. He realized then that he wasn't just grateful to Grace for her presence in Eli's life. He wanted her in his own life as well, and for the first time, he dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she felt the same. The next few weeks were a time of transformation within the Ellis household. The tentative bond between Calvin, Grace, and Eli grew stronger each day, as if they were all part of a delicate dance. Gradually finding their rhythm together, Grace noticed that Calvin was more involved than ever with Eli, making time to join them in their small routines and moments that, before, he might have overlooked. The mansion, once cold and silent, was filled with laughter and warmth, as Eli's joy became infectious, seeping into every corner of the house. One Saturday morning, Grace arrived to find Calvin in the kitchen, an apron tied around his waist and a bewildered expression on his face. He stood in front of a countertop covered in flour, eggs, and various kitchen utensils scattered haphazardly. It was clear he'd been attempting to make pancakes, though the outcome was less than successful. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," Grace greeted him, suppressing a smile at the sight. Calvin looked up, his expression equal parts sheepish and determined. "I thought I'd try something new," he admitted, gesturing to the mess with a wry smile. "Eli mentioned he wanted pancakes, and I figured, well, how hard could it be?" Grace chuckled, stepping closer to assess the situation. "It's a nice thought," she replied, glancing at the slightly charred pancake sitting sadly in the pan. "But I think maybe a little guidance wouldn't hurt." Eli, who had just bounded into the kitchen, looked between his father and Grace, his eyes bright with excitement. "Grace, Dad's making pancakes, but..." He trailed off, wrinkling his nose as he examined the slightly blackened creations. "Maybe you can help him." Calvin looked at Grace, a hopeful expression on his face. "If you're willing, I could use an expert's touch." Grace nodded, smiling. "All right, let's start from scratch. I'll teach you both." Under her guidance, Calvin and Eli followed her instructions carefully. She showed them how to whisk the batter gently, how to measure the flour correctly, and how to keep the pan at the right temperature. Calvin's initial awkwardness gave way to enjoyment as he and Eli laughed together, each step becoming less about perfect pancakes and more about the fun of trying something new together. As they finished cooking and sat down to enjoy their breakfast, Calvin felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. It was a simple moment, just him, Grace, and Eli sharing a meal together, but it felt extraordinary. He looked across the table at Grace, who was laughing with Eli as he smeared syrup on his pancakes, and felt a warmth bloom in his chest. After breakfast, they spent the day together as a family, something Calvin had never envisioned himself doing. They went to the park, played soccer on the open field, and ended up feeding the ducks by the pond as the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over everything. For once, Calvin wasn't thinking about work or the worries of his business. He was focused entirely on the people beside him, savoring each moment as they laughed and talked freely. Later that evening, as they returned to the mansion, Grace helped Eli settle down for bed. Calvin watched from the doorway as she gently tucked him in, reading him one of his favorite stories. Eli's eyes grew heavy, and eventually, he drifted off, his small hand wrapped around Grace's fingers as she whispered goodnight. Grace quietly slipped out of Eli's room and nearly bumped into Calvin, who was standing just outside the door. She started, a soft laugh escaping her as she stepped back. "You scared me," she whispered, glancing at him with a smile. "Sorry," Calvin replied, his voice low. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to thank you." Again, she shook her head, dismissing his words gently. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Calvin. I'm happy to be here for Eli." They stood in the dim hallway, the house silent around them, and Calvin found himself reluctant to let her go. He took a small breath, gathering his courage before speaking again. "Grace, I know I've said this before, but you've brought something into our lives that I didn't know we needed." Grace looked up at him, her expression softening as she met his gaze. "Eli is a wonderful child, and you're a good father, Calvin. It's been amazing to see how much he's blossomed with you here for him." Calvin shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "If I am a better father, it's because of you, Grace. You showed me what I was missing, what was truly important." He hesitated, his eyes holding hers. "And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Grace's breath caught, her heart racing as she absorbed his words. There was a sincerity in his gaze, a depth of feeling that she hadn't expected. She hadn't allowed herself to consider the possibility that Calvin might feel something more for her. But now, standing there in the quiet glow of the hallway, she felt it, an undeniable connection. "Calvin," she began softly, her voice barely a whisper, I care about you too, about both of you, more than I thought I would." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Then, as if moved by some invisible force, Calvin reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a tentative but unmistakable gesture. Grace didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed her fingers to entwine with his, their hands clasped together in a gentle but profound acknowledgement. They stood like that for a long moment, the silence between them filled with everything they had yet to say. And then, slowly, Calvin leaned forward, his eyes holding hers, asking a silent question. Grace felt her pulse quicken, a warmth spreading through her, and she nodded, a small, affirming smile on her lips. Their lips met in a gentle, tender kiss, a quiet exchange that held the promise of something new, something hopeful. It was a moment filled with unspoken words and shared understanding, a beginning that felt both natural and inevitable. When they finally parted, both of them were smiling, their hands still entwined. "I want this to be real," Calvin said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "Not just for Eli, but for us. I want a life with you, Grace." She nodded, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "I want that too, Calvin. For all of us." They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing their dreams and fears, each opening up in ways they hadn't before. For the first time, Calvin allowed himself to be vulnerable, to share pieces of his past, of the loneliness he'd carried. And Grace, in turn, spoke of her journey, her struggles as a single mother, and the hopes she'd had for Owen's future. As the hours slipped by, they both felt a profound sense of connection, a bond that was no longer defined by roles or obligations, but by love and a mutual desire to build a future together. By the time they said goodnight, each returning to their rooms with hearts full and spirits lifted, they knew that their lives had changed irrevocably. They weren't just two people from different worlds anymore. They were a family, and the future they were building together was filled with hope, laughter, and the kind of love that made everything else fall into place. The days that followed their quiet confession in the hallway were nothing short of magical. The Ellis mansion felt like a different place, no longer a grand, empty house, but a warm, welcoming home filled with laughter and love. Grace, Calvin, Eli, and Owen had seamlessly become a family, bound by a shared journey and the deep affection they held for each other. On a bright morning, as the weekend sun filtered through the mansion's large windows, Calvin gathered everyone in the living room. There was an excitement in his eyes that both Grace and Eli noticed immediately. "I've been thinking," he began, looking at them with a warmth that was still new but genuine. "We've been through a lot of changes recently, and I want to do something special to mark this new beginning." Grace tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "What did you have in mind?" Calvin glanced at Eli, then at Grace and Owen, before taking a deep breath. "I was thinking, why don't we take a family trip? Just the four of us, somewhere special." Eli's eyes widened, and he looked at his father in amazement. "A family trip, really?" Calvin chuckled, nodding. "Yes, really. We deserve some time away from the routines, just to enjoy each other's company and relax." Grace smiled, her heart swelling at the thought of spending time with them away from the mansion. It felt like the perfect way to seal the bond they had been building. "That sounds wonderful," she said, her voice warm. And so, with eager excitement, they began planning their first family trip. After much discussion, they decided on a cabin by the lake, a peaceful retreat nestled amidst the woods. It was a place where they could enjoy the simplicity of nature. No business calls, no household duties, just them. The following weekend, they packed up the car and headed toward the cabin, the journey filled with laughter and anticipation. Owen and Eli, who had become more like brothers than friends, played games in the back seat, while Grace and Calvin shared quiet smiles in the front, their hands occasionally finding each other's. When they arrived at the cabin, the boys ran ahead, bursting with energy and excitement. The cabin was cozy, with a rustic charm that was both comfortable and inviting. There was a large deck overlooking the lake, where the sunlight danced on the water's surface, and the woods surrounding them felt like an embrace from nature itself. They spent the weekend exploring the lake, hiking along the trails, and sitting around a crackling fire as the sun dipped below the horizon each evening. Calvin, who had once been tethered to his work and responsibilities, found himself fully present, enjoying the simple joys of being surrounded by those he loved. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Calvin and Grace sat on the deck, wrapped in blankets as they watched the stars above them. The night air was cool, and the sounds of the forest filled the quiet around them. "Thank you for coming back," Calvin said softly, his gaze steady on Grace's face. "For giving us, a chance to be a real family." Grace looked at him, her heart full as she reached for his hand. "Thank you for letting me in." "Calvin, I never expected my life to take this turn, but it feels like this is where I'm meant to be." They shared a gentle, heartfelt kiss, a quiet promise of the life they would build together. For Grace, the journey from the quiet, determined single mother to a woman loved and cherished in a family of her own felt nothing short of miraculous. And for Calvin, the transformation from a man bound by cold ambition to a father and partner filled with warmth and love was something he hadn't thought possible. The next morning, they took the boys down to the lake. Eli and Owen splashed in the shallow water, their laughter ringing out as they played together. Grace watched them with a smile, her heart swelling with pride and happiness. Calvin stood beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders as they enjoyed the scene. "They look so happy," he murmured, a deep contentment in his voice. "They are happy," Grace replied. "We all are," as the morning stretched into afternoon. They enjoyed a picnic by the lake, with sandwiches, fruit, and plenty of laughter. Calvin, who once would have seen such a day as a distraction from his work, now reveled in the simplicity of it. He felt complete, at peace with the life he had once taken for granted that evening, as they sat around a small fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Eli looked up at Grace with a thoughtful expression. "Grace, do you think you'll always stay with us?" he asked, his voice filled with childlike wonder. Grace smiled, reaching over to brush a stray hair from his forehead. Yes, Eli, I plan to be here, with all of you, for a long, long time. Calvin reached over, squeezing Grace's hand as he added, and soon we'll make that official. Grace looked at him, her brows raising slightly. Calvin's gaze softened as he pulled a small box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring, sparkling in the firelight. Grace, I can't imagine my life without you anymore. You've brought light and love into my world in a way I never thought possible. Will you marry me? He asked, his voice filled with sincerity and hope. Grace felt tears fill her eyes as she looked at the man who had once been so distant, so closed off now. Here he was, open and vulnerable, offering her the kind of love she had always dreamed of, but had never expected to find. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Yes, Calvin, I will. The boys cheered, clapping and laughing as Calvin slipped the ring onto her finger. Sealing their future together, they spent the rest of the night under the stars, basking in the joy of a new beginning, a future filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a family that had found each other against all odds. As the night grew quiet and the fire died down, Grace sat beside Calvin, her hand resting in his. She looked at the faces of her new family, each of them bringing something unique and wonderful to her life. For the first time, she felt a peace she hadn't known before, a sense of belonging that ran deep. This was the family she'd always hoped for, the life she'd always deserved. And now, she knew they would face the future together, bound by the love and resilience they had each found in one another. As dawn approached, they drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the warmth of family, knowing that this was just the beginning of a beautiful, shared journey.